Pecco Bagnaia was chasing pole by using Marc Márquez's own weapon against him. That was the strange part of this moment, because in MotoGP, Marc has always understood one brutal truth. If you want the perfect lap, find the rider who has no choice but to push. And right now, that rider was Marc Márquez. The entire session was starting to tighten. The clock was running down. The track was fast, and every rider at the front knew one mistake could decide the grid. Bagnaia was no longer waiting. He was in full attack mode. Behind him, Raul Fernandez was close enough to feel the pull. Ahead of them was one of the hardest braking zones at Brno. Turn 3, a place where speed becomes pressure, where the bike charges down the straight, then the rider has to squeeze the front brake as long as he dares. Over 200 kilometers per hour disappear in just a few hundred meters. Brake too early, and the lap is gone. Brake too late, and the corner disappears. Bagnaia attacked it like a man who knew exactly what was at stake. A second straight pole was within reach. A statement was within reach. And maybe most importantly, the chance to beat Marc Márquez on a day where everyone was watching him. But this was not only Bagnaia's fight. Marc was still there, still dangerous, still close enough to change the story with one clean sector. And behind them, more threats were coming. Ai Ogura was building a lap that looked frightening. Fabio Di Giannantonio was charging. The newly resurfaced Brno circuit was giving the riders grip, and that grip was turning Q2 into something wild. The lap record was under attack. The front row was under attack, and the balance of power was starting to move. Bagnaia crossed the sectors with speed. Marc Márquez remained the target. Ogura was coming fast, and suddenly, the question was not just who could take pole. The real question was much bigger. Could anyone survive this attack? When Marc Márquez's own tactic had turned the entire session into a war? The first strike belonged to Pecco Bagnaia. He crossed the line with a 151.383, and for a moment, it looked like the battle had turned his way. Provisional pole, a serious lap, a clear warning to everyone else. Bagnaia had done what champions do. He found speed when the pressure was rising. He delivered in the final sector, and he put the number on the screen that every other rider now had to chase. But there was one problem. This was not a normal Q2 session, and Bagnaia was not the only rider building something dangerous. Marc Márquez was still out there. The same rider who had won at Brno before. The same rider who could turn one clean final sector into a front row start. The same name that still makes every lap feel heavier for the rest of the grid. When Marc is on a fast lap, nobody relaxes, because even if he is not perfect in the first part of the lap, he can still hurt you at the end. And that was the pressure now. Bagnaia had set the time. Marc had to answer. The front row was still alive. But then, Ai Ogura appeared, and suddenly, the fight changed completely. He was not just improving, he was attacking the impossible. Before this weekend, a 151 lap at Brno was already something special. Now Ogura was pushing so hard that the timing screen started flirting with a 150. That number mattered, because in qualifying, there are fast laps, and then there are laps that make everyone else look like they are playing catch-up. Ogura was moving toward the second kind. Sector by sector, he kept the lap alive. No panic, no wasted movement, no obvious mistake. The bike looked settled. The speed kept coming. And while Bagnaia had already put himself on provisional pole, Ogura was building a lap that threatened to erase it. Then Marc Márquez crossed the line. For a moment, it became a familiar story. Bagnaia and Márquez, 1 and 2. Two giants on the timing screen. Two names that could have easily defined the entire session by themselves. But this time, the story was not finished, because Ogura was still coming. And when he reached the line, everything changed. 1 minute 51.139 seconds. Pole position. Not by a tiny margin. Not by luck. Not by just sneaking ahead at the final second. He went clear, almost a quarter of a second faster than Bagnaia. Almost 3/10 ahead of Marc Márquez. That is not just taking pole. That is taking control. And the shock was not only the lap time. It was who he beat to get there. Bagnaia had thrown down a world-class lap. Marc Márquez was still close to the front. Fabio Di Giannantonio delivered a strong 151.350, but none of them could match Ogura. Not Bagnaia, not Marc, not Di Giannantonio, not Bezzecchi, not Martin. The entire grid had been pulled into Ogura's fight, and nobody had an answer. For Bezzecchi, the challenge was clear. He had to find a way through a narrow gap in the standings. The front row was close enough to chase, but difficult enough to miss. He needed precision. He needed one clean lap. He needed to beat names like Di Giannantonio, Bagnaia, and Marc Márquez just to stand beside Ogura. That is how high the level had become. And for Jorge Martin, the situation was even worse. He was sitting 10th, running out of time, running out of space, and running out of chances. While Ogura was fighting for pole, Martin was fighting just to avoid being buried on the grid. That contrast made the session feel brutal. At the front, Ogura was creating history. Behind him, riders with far more experience were trying to survive the damage. Bagnaia had hope. Then Ogura raised the target. Marc had a chance. Then Ogura moved the limit. Di Giannantonio had pace. But even that was not enough. Every time someone looked close, Ogura made the lap time feel farther away. And that was the defining moment of the session. Because this was no longer just about pole position. It was about a young rider stepping into a fight with MotoGP's biggest names and refusing to look small. Bagnaia attacked first. Marc Márquez stayed dangerous. Di Giannantonio pushed hard. Bezzecchi searched for one final answer. But Ai Ogura had already changed the story. And the biggest threat was still ahead. Because when a rider takes pole like that, the question is not only how fast he was for one lap, the question is whether the rest of the grid can stop him when the real battle begins. But there is one detail almost everyone is missing. Marc Márquez was not beaten because he crashed. He was not beaten because he made one obvious mistake. He simply stopped attacking. And in a Q2 session this tight, that says a lot. Bezzecchi had just moved up to 4th with a 151.428. It was a strong lap, but not strong enough for the front row. Raul Fernandez had already rolled off after putting himself 7th. Diego Moreira was sitting 6th, and Marc Márquez was cruising. That was the strange part. For most riders, 5th place in a session this fast would look like a good result. But for Marc, it feels different, because when Marc is on track, people expect the attack to continue until the final possible moment. This time, it did not. In simple terms, Marc looked like he had accepted the second row. He was not pushing at full speed through the final part of the lap. He was not fighting the bike for one last miracle. He crossed the line without the body language of a rider chasing pole. From a racing perspective, this may suggest one of two things. Either Marc did not have the feeling to improve, or he knew the risk was no longer worth the reward. And that matters, because Brno is not only about one perfect lap. It is a circuit where braking stability, corner exit, and rear grip can decide everything. If a rider feels he cannot gain enough time without over-pushing the front tire or losing the rear on exit, sometimes the smartest move is to stop forcing it. That does not mean Marc was slow. It means the window to improve may have closed. And when that happens in qualifying, the rider has to choose. Risk everything for one better grid position, or protect the race ahead. This could mean that Marc Márquez was already thinking beyond Q2. Starting 5th is not perfect, but it keeps him in the fight. He is still close enough to attack early, close enough to pressure the front group, and close enough to turn the race into a long battle instead of a one-lap gamble. Jorge Martin had a very different problem. He was sitting 10th, and even though he found a personal best in one sector, he was still almost half a second down. That is the worst kind of qualifying pressure, because the rider is improving, but not enough. He can feel the lap getting better, but the timing screen says the front rows are still too far away. For a rider like Martin, that is dangerous, because he already needed a strong qualifying. With penalties waiting in the race, starting low on the grid makes everything harder. He cannot simply ride a normal race and wait. He may have to attack early, take risks, pass riders before the race settles, and that creates another problem. When a rider starts deeper in the field, he uses more tire, more energy, and more aggression just to reach the group he wanted to start with. That can change the entire shape of his Sunday. Everything points to a race where Marc Márquez has options, but Jorge Martin has pressure. Marc can start from the second row and still build a race. Martin may have to rescue one, and that is the hidden difference. One rider accepted damage. The other may have lost control of his weekend. The prediction is simple. If Marc gets a strong launch, he can still be part of the fight near the front.